Literally woke up one morning and decided that building a tiny house was the way to go. So it took 4 months. It was pretty surreal, really. Even when you work through the process of being there every day, it was still quite a beautiful sort of, that moment of it's everything I wanted.
The average size of new houses has been declining for about 10 years. This has come about not just as a result of more apartments being built, but also the size of standalone dwellings has decreased. And while there's still a body of opinion which says that building a bigger house is better for capital gains and resale, there's also a group of people who aren't so driven by that idea. They see their houses less as commodities and more as homes, and they're often more intimately involved in their construction. What motivates them?
Just seemed to make sense to me at the time. Flexibility, affordability to a certain extent, and being able to make my own story, really, instead of having to be particularly tied into a mortgage, which was the only way I could see going forward.
So this is a house that myself and my cousins and a very helpful neighbour, we built together. My cousins and I paid for the house and we built it ourselves. Every screw, I won't say nail, there's a huge amount of screws, a lot of plywood, but it was very satisfying to be able to both design the house, then build it, and then live in it as a home for our extended family, shall we say. And I think that having, it's been designed so that it's very flexible, so that it can take one family or two families, or somebody staying longer and somebody staying shorter, or somebody out for the weekend. So it's a very amorphous sort of plan so that it can be flexible. And I think flexibility for me is a really key point in housing design.
Are you surprised at how little it takes to live really well?
Yeah, and it's, you have to be in the right mindset. It certainly is slightly more challenging at times, and you kind of need to just take it as a bit of an experience. There were definitely times, I've got a very busy lifestyle, certainly when I was living in Wanaka, and there were times when it kind of had that feeling like I actually don't have enough time to live this way, because even just things like a composting toilet requires more effort than flushing it down conventional toilet. So it's a mindset. You have to be willing to do it. You wouldn't be able to get someone who wasn't interested to live in an off-grid in a tiny house, I think. One of the really beautiful parts of having the tiny house, I guess, is that it is able to be built yourself, and a lot of people do build them themselves. And because you don't need to be within the Building Act, which requires all your sign-off by your plumbers and your electricians and your builders and all the rest of it, then people really get to have that experience, and it really becomes their home, which is hopefully what people are doing this for. If we put it in the Building Act and suddenly it needs all of these boxes ticked, then you end up in the same situation as you've got for houses, which raises costs. It means less people are likely to really be involved in the build themselves.
The fact that we've done it, and you can look at, like Bryony made the table, and we can remember the day that we put in this piece of wood or this window, or all of these things. So it all just has brings home the really heartfelt feeling of what it's like to have your own house. And I think to me that's so much more than having a house that is something that you just walk into. Somebody else has built, somebody else has carpeted, they've chosen the colour scheme and all the fittings. Just being able to say, this is what we're going to do with our money and create it like that is hugely psychologically important. This feels more like home than anything I've lived in.
The people who are attracted to building a smaller house or home generally seem to be interested in, or even driven by, the concept of sustainability.
Sustainability is across your 3 spheres, so you've got your environmental, social and economic. The tiny house filled all of those areas for me. So environmentally, certainly, it's a lower footprint because of what I chose to do with the materials. Materials that have got low chemicals in them. It's very low footprint in terms of needing heat to heat it, and obviously there's a fireplace and we get firewood from our own property. Socially was actually probably one of the biggest ones for me in terms of I was in a place where I had nowhere to live. I was really unsure about what I was going to do for my future. And I also, I did have a piece of property that I could put it on. So for me, it was about building a home. It was about building somewhere that I knew was mine and that, I could come home every night and, and be in my own home. And then economically, by far, I had saved up enough to build this tiny house, about $100,000, but I wasn't going to get into a house in Wanaka for that.
While Guy and his whānau built their own home in Pukirua Bay by themselves, it still had to comply with the normal building code requirements. Further south in Invercargill, Ella managed to avoid consent issues to a significant degree because her tiny house was on wheels.
It's certainly, there's still, the actual tiny house itself, it's a grey area. So because it's on wheels, it doesn't need a building consent. However, when councils look at it, they say if it's in one place for, I'm not sure how long it is, more than a couple of months I think it is, then you can say that it is a dwelling, so it's officially a building, and therefore it needs to be within the Building Act. Some of the challenges for a tiny house if you're within the building code is you need to have, there's a lot of sort of stability and durability in the frame, so to make it safe. Unfortunately, if you put too much material into the frame, you're too heavy to be on the trailer. So you've got to stay under 3.5 tonne for the trailer that it's on, which means that you have to reduce the amount of materials in your tiny house. So you've got these real challenges around if you were to build to code in the Building Act, versus being able to be called a trailer and therefore be able to move it on the road.
So there seem to be benefits to the hands-on approach to designing and building a smaller home, rather than, say, buying an existing bigger house. Do you feel that this is the way of the future?
I think whilst New Zealanders still think of their homes or houses as commodity and not homes, I think we're going to continue to see that trend. So I've had plenty of friends who have been through the experience of building homes, and you've got the builders and the architects, or possibly not even architects, if they do have a bit more money to spare, they'll say make it bigger because it's better for resale, rather than make it bigger because that's going to be the best home that you have.
From her experience as a councillor for Queenstown Lakes and Otago Regional Council and a tiny homeowner, does she think councils could be more liberal in their approach to building codes and consents?
I would like to see a council brave enough to work with some really forward-thinking young people I know out there who want to create tiny house villages. And I think those villages would look something like communal laundry with potentially a communal kitchen, and then a number of tiny homes on the property. It would have to be a sort of shared ownership kind of model. So again, it'll be different. It needs to be a bit flexible, and the council would need to be open to how they would be able to rate and do all those other things. But it's all very doable. It just requires a bit of creativity, and I'd really love to see some councils around the country be brave enough to take that on.
This program was made possible by the RNZ NZ On Air Innovation Fund.